April 8th, 1943. 27,000 feet above the French countryside near Caen. Through the crystal canopy of his Focke-Wulfs 191A5, Oberleutnant Ralph Herrmischen couldn't hide his smirk behind the oxygen mask. Below him, climbing sluggishly through the thin air, came the ungainly shapes of the newest American fighters. He watched them with a mix of curiosity and amusement. "The Army has sent us flying milk bottles," he radioed to his wingman, laughter breaking through his voice as he studied the massive aircraft struggling toward altitude, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt making its combat debut over occupied Europe. 16 P-47Cs from the 4th Fighter Group labored upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines roaring against the weight of their 7-ton airframes. To German eyes, used to the sleek Spitfire or the agile Soviet Yak, these American machines looked absurd. Barrel-bodied brutes with tiny wings, massive propellers, and an awkward silhouette that seemed to defy flight itself. What Herrmischen didn't know, what none of the circling German pilots could have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would soon decimate the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, those flying milk bottles would become the most feared hunters in the sky. The laughter would fade beneath the staccato thunder of 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, the sound that would haunt every German pilot from Normandy to Berlin. The mathematics of destruction were already written into those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire of 6,000 rounds per minute, enough to tear a Messerschmitt in half in under 2 seconds. That April morning, Major Donald Blakesley of the 335th Fighter Squadron spotted Herrmischen's formation preparing to strike. A former RAF Eagle Squadron veteran, Blakesley knew something his new pilots didn't, that survival in a Thunderbolt meant unlearning everything they thought they knew about air combat. The P-47 was not built to turn, but to endure, not to outdance the enemy, but to outlast him. It represented a revolution in air warfare, a machine built on mass, power, and firepower, rather than finesse. On that morning, there were not just 56 American pilots over France. There were the future aces whose names would echo across Europe, but on that morning they were rookies in an untested aircraft facing the most seasoned fighter force in the world. The Luftwaffe's veterans had fought from Poland to Russia. The Americans had yet to fire a single shot in combat. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how American engineering turned ridicule into terror, and how the laughter of German pilots was silenced by the relentless math of American firepower. The P-47's origins lay in panic. In June 1940, as German forces swept across France, Republic Aviation's chief designer Alexander Kartveli was handed a desperate request from the U.S. Army Air Corps to create a high-altitude interceptor to challenge the Luftwaffe's best. Kartveli didn't just design a fighter, he built a monster. He told his team, "It will be a dinosaur, but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." When the XP-47B first flew on May 6, 1941, it stunned observers. At nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Its enormous turbo supercharger, housed in the rear fuselage, gave it a bulging, almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approached it with disbelief, yet once airborne, it astonished everyone. The 18-cylinder R-2800 engine could deliver full power at 27,000 feet, a level where most German engines gasped for breath. Its turbo supercharger fed sea-level performance into the thin air of the stratosphere. Major Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group in Connecticut, initially loathed the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft to training accidents. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in its first months of combat. It torque-rolled on takeoff, ground-looped on landing, and dove so fast that pilots encountered compressibility for the first time, their controls locking up as shock waves formed on the wings. But for those who mastered it, the Thunderbolt revealed its true nature. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a young Oklahoman who would become one of America's top aces, remembered his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. The first combat encounters in the spring of 1943 confirmed every German prejudice. The P-47 couldn't turn with the FW-190 or climb with the Bf-110. Luftwaffe pilots quickly devised tactics to exploit its weaknesses, diving in from below or forcing it into turning fights where agility mattered more than armor. Oberst Josef Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported after his first engagement, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." The statistics supported his confidence. In their first month of combat, the Americans lost 14 Thunderbolts for only 3 confirmed kills. British Spitfire pilots watching from their squadrons joked that the best evasive move in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around its spacious cockpit. But beneath the ridicule, something was changing. The Thunderbolts that came home were riddled with holes and still flying. One returned from a mission peppered with more than 100 bullet strikes and 21 cannon hits, damage that would have shredded any German or British fighter. Its massive radial engine, air-cooled and without vulnerable coolant lines, shrugged off punishment that would have killed a Merlin-powered Spitfire outright. And when the Thunderbolt's guns did connect, the effect was devastating. Its 8 Brownings produced a storm of lead unlike anything in the sky, with a convergent zone so dense that a single burst could erase a target. It could sustain fire for over 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. Everything changed on June 26, 1943, over Le Tréport, France. That day, 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron would cement the legend of the P-47. His group of 48 P-47s was returning from bomber escort duty when 16 Focke-Wulfs Mun-19s from JG-26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland, attacked from the sun with perfect precision. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in the crossfire. In seconds, 20 20-millimeter cannon shells tore through his aircraft. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. The engine cowling was ripped apart, flames licking at the control panel. What followed would redefine the legend of the P-47 and forever silence the laughter of those who had once called it a milk bottle. Johnson was bleeding from shrapnel wounds to his nose and leg when he realized he couldn't bail out. A 20-millimeter shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it shut. Trapped in a dying aircraft nearly 6 miles above France, he had no... Blinded by oil splattered across the windscreen, his engine coughing and shaking violently, and his controls barely responding, Johnson fought to keep the Thunderbolt level. Against all logic, the shattered P-47 stayed in the air, holding together through sheer will and the brute strength of its design. Then the situation grew worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 119 spotted the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the English Channel at barely 170 miles an hour. The German pilot's identity has never been definitively confirmed, though post-war records suggest several possible names from JG-26. What is certain is that he would soon become part of one of the most incredible encounters in aviation history. The German closed in from behind and opened fire, unleashing his full load of 4 20-millimeter cannons and 2 13-millimeter machine guns. Johnson could do nothing but hunch behind his armor plate and pray. The Thunderbolt absorbed everything, every cannon shell, every burst of machine gun fire, until the Luftwaffe pilot's heavy ammunition was gone. He repositioned and fired again with what remained, bullets raking across the mangled fuselage. When the guns finally fell silent, the German eased up alongside the wreck he'd been trying to kill. Through the shattered canopy, Johnson could see him clearly, a young blond face etched with disbelief. The pilot stared, shook his head, then saluted before banking away toward France, his ammunition exhausted. Somehow, the P-47 was still flying. Johnson coaxed it across the channel and managed a crash landing at Manston. His crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. One cannon shell had exploded inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated against the armor plate behind his seat. The engine was a wreck. Cable controls were shredded. 3 of the 4 main structural beams of the fuselage were shot through. Yet the aircraft had carried its pilot home. The survival of Johnson's Thunderbolt sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers studying the wreckage realized their aircraft was far tougher than even they had believed. German intelligence officers reading combat reports from Jagdgeschwader 26 dismissed them as exaggerations until multiple eyewitness accounts confirmed the impossible. The P-47 had absorbed the full fury of the Luftwaffe's best, and lived to tell the tale. By mid-1943, American pilots were beginning to understand how to fight on their own terms. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, summed it up through brutal experience. Don't turn with them, don't climb with them low. Use your weight, your power, your guns. What had once been seen as the Thunderbolt's greatest weakness, its massive size, became its deadliest strength. In a dive, nothing in the world could catch it. From 30,000 feet, the P-47 could reach 550 miles an hour, faster than any German fighter could safely achieve. And when it pulled back up, that speed translated into altitude and energy that left the enemy far below. Captain Walker, Bud Mahurin, was among the first to master this new style of fighting, the boom and zoom. The Thunderbolts would climb high above 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled for power. When the enemy appeared below, they rolled inverted and dove, building unstoppable speed. At the bottom of the dive came a brief, thunderous burst of 8 heavy machine guns. German pilots who lived through it described the moment as flying into a wall of lead. Targets didn't just fall, they vanished. The full measure of this firepower was revealed during the great raids of August 17, 1943, when American bombers struck Schweinfurt and Regensburg deep inside Germany. The mission exposed the P-47's biggest weakness, limited range, but also its devastating strength when used properly. Major David Schilling led his 62nd Fighter Group into combat against a formation of Messerschmitts 110s, twin-engine heavy fighters armed with cannons and rockets designed to rip apart bomber formations. From 28,000 feet, Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts dove like meteors. A surviving German gunner, Unterhafiz Heinrich Roth, later recalled, "They came down like hammers from heaven. I hit one at 800 meters, good hits on the wing. It didn't even flinch. Then it fired. The aircraft ahead of us just came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. In less than a minute, 8 Messerschmitts were obliterated." Each Thunderbolt carried over 3,400 rounds of ammunition, almost 900 pounds of lead and brass. At their convergence range of 300 yards, all 8 guns focused into a circle barely 6 feet wide, unleashing 100 projectiles every second at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The effect was absolute devastation. While German fighters carried limited cannon ammunition, often less than 200 rounds, American pilots could fire for more than 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. Their ammunition belts mixed armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, designed to both tear and ignite. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become America's top ace in Europe, summed it up. "When you hit them with all 8, they don't go down, they explode. I saw a 109 split in half, the tail going one way, the wings another. The pilot never even knew what hit him." By the fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe began to realize the grim truth. The Thunderbolt's performance improved with altitude, while their own fighters faltered. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine could hold full power above 30,000 feet, where German aircraft gasped for air. Oberlieutenant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's top aces with 206 victories, learned that lesson fatally. On a mission over northern France, his Focke-Wulf AW-119 struggled for air at 28,000 feet, its engine wheezing in the thin atmosphere. The P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group pounced from above. Robert Johnson, now a rising ace himself, spotted Philip's distinctive aircraft and opened fire from 300 yards. His combat report was cold and precise. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's most celebrated veterans, was gone in an instant. His death shook the German Air Force. If a pilot of his caliber, a man who had survived more than 500 combat missions, couldn't escape the Thunderbolt, what hope did anyone have? The High Command ordered an immediate investigation. The report that landed on Hermann Göring's desk in November 1943 was chilling. The Thunderbolt could climb higher than any German fighter. It could dive faster than any aircraft in existence. Its armor and construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional planes. And by January 1944, the Luftwaffe would face a new variant, one that would carry more fuel, more firepower, and seal the Thunderbolt's transformation from object of ridicule into the nightmare of the German skies. The P-47 D-22 marked a turning point in the Thunderbolt's evolution. It was fitted with a Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller, 13 feet in diameter, with massive paddle-shaped blades that bit into the air like oars driving through water. The difference was immediate and dramatic. Earlier Thunderbolts had climbed sluggishly, barely managing 2,200 feet per minute at sea level. With the new paddle blade propeller, the rate of climb soared to 3,000 feet per minute, finally matching or surpassing the best German fighters at most altitudes. The giant propeller also transformed the way the Thunderbolt accelerated. It could now build energy far more quickly in level flight, turning what had been a lumbering brute into a predator capable of sudden bursts of speed. In February 1944, Luftwaffe veteran Helmut Knocke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a man who had flown over 200 combat missions, met the new P-47s for the first time near Hanover during a bomber interception. In his diary he wrote, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart, nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the very sound of the aircraft. The huge blades drove air so violently that the tips reached near supersonic speeds, creating a deep rolling thunder that could be heard for miles. German troops on the ground said they could recognize P-47s long before they saw them. A low, ominous growl that meant death was coming. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, the Thunderbolt's reach had expanded.
with external fuel tanks slunning beneath its wings or belly, 2 108-gallon wing tanks, or a 75-gallon centerline tank. It could now escort bombers deep into Germany, pushing its range past 1,000 miles. The new propeller gave it the performance it needed even when carrying the extra weight. Once the tanks were dropped, the Thunderbolts could fight at full strength, ready to engage the Luftwaffe on equal terms. For German pilots, the skies were becoming a nightmare. The only hope was to attack the bombers directly, punching through the wall of American fighters and inflicting enough losses to halt the daylight offensive. But reaching the bombers now meant flying straight into the Thunderbolts' guns, a gamble that became increasingly suicidal. Major Gunther Rohl, one of Germany's greatest aces with 275 victories, learned this the hard way on March 6, 1944. He later recalled, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, transformed into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death." The escort missions revealed another advantage: endurance. The Thunderbolt's massive radial engine, though powerful, could cruise efficiently at high altitude. While German fighters guzzled fuel at maximum power and were forced to return home after short engagements, the P-47s could stay with the bombers for hours, trading altitude for range and maintaining top cover all the way back to England. By the spring of 1944, as the long-range P-51 Mustangs began to take over deep escort duties, Thunderbolt units shifted toward a new and equally vital role: ground attack. The change was natural. The P-47's armor, firepower, and ruggedness made it ideal for low-level operations where other aircraft couldn't survive. The transformation began in earnest in April, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France. The P-47's 8 heavy machine guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, proved devastating against ground targets. A 2-second burst sent 160 half-inch projectiles into a space no larger than a truck, shredding soft targets and even punching through the thin top armor of German vehicles. Then came bombs and rockets. The P-47 D-25 could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs beneath its wings and another 500-pounder under the fuselage, the same bomb load as some early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length launch stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each packing the power of a 105mm artillery shell. Colonel Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, remembered the horror vividly. "They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming, and then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. We called them jabos, fighter bombers, but these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers." On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe finally saw how completely the balance of power had shifted. More than 500 P-47s provided air cover over the invasion beaches, forming an unbreakable shield from sea level to 30,000 feet. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II
was only one of 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day. He later said, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." In the weeks after D-Day, Thunderbolts ruled the daylight skies of France. Their impact was staggering. In June alone, P-47s of the 9th Air Force destroyed 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and more than 4,500 horse-drawn transports. The Wehrmacht could move only at night, paralyzed by the fear of instant destruction from above. The Germans tried everything: heavier armor on their vehicles, denser anti-aircraft defenses, elaborate camouflage. But nothing worked. The Thunderbolt was too fast, too tough, and too heavily armed. Even the dreaded 88mm flat guns struggled to track them at low altitude. While Europe burned beneath their wings, the P-47 was proving itself equally deadly across the world. In the Pacific, the 348th Fighter Group found that the same qualities that made the Thunderbolt dominant in Europe made it perfect for the vast distances and brutal heat of the Pacific theater. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics tailored to the region's sprawling battlefields. On October 11, 1943, he led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak. In the chaos that followed, Kirby shot down 6 enemy planes himself, earning the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, used to fragile but agile opponents, were stunned. Their 20mm cannon shells, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to barely scratch the Thunderbolt's armor. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart." The final evolution came with the P-47N, a variant built specifically for the Pacific. It featured extended, fuel-filled wings holding 93 gallons each, boosting total range to more than 2,300 miles. This long-legged version could escort B-29s all the way to Japan and back, completing the Thunderbolt's transformation from a short-range interceptor into a true intercontinental fighter bomber. From the skies over France to the jungles of New Guinea, the P-47 Thunderbolt earned its reputation as one of the most formidable aircraft of the Second World War, a machine that began as a heavy underdog and became the hammer of Allied air power. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47 Thunderbolt's evolution came in its encounters with the most advanced weapons of Nazi Germany, the jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its blistering top speed of 540 miles per hour, should have been utterly untouchable by any propeller-driven aircraft. Yet Thunderbolt pilots soon discovered that even jets had their weaknesses. There were 2 moments when they could be caught: during takeoff and landing, when the jets were slow and vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from altitude, where the P-47's massive weight and aerodynamic strength came into play. On November 27, 1944,
Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me-262 with a Thunderbolt. Diving from 28,000 feet, his P-47 reached nearly 500 miles per hour in level flight. The German pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never even saw the Thunderbolt closing in from above. Meyer opened fire at 400 yards, and in his combat report, he described the result. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fury of 850 caliber machine guns proved far more devastating than anyone expected, even against a jet. By early 1945, the Thunderbolt's evolution reached its peak with the specialized P-47M variant, aircraft built specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting their engines to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics improving speed, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to challenge even jets under the right conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron, downed 2 Me-262s in March 1945. In his tactical report, he wrote, "The jets are faster, but they can't turn and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery and they come apart like they're made of paper. They have to slow down to attack bombers. That's when we get them." If the P-47 symbolized American engineering power, its greatest demonstration came not just in combat, but in sheer production might, a power put to the test during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's final desperate gamble to cripple Allied air power. On New Year's Day 1945, nearly 900 German fighters, many flown by their last experienced pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's Thunderbolts, the assault hit hard. German aircraft destroyed 22 P-47s on the ground, along with several others. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post, pointed to the burning wrecks and sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' reply became legend throughout the 9th Air Force. He simply gestured toward the flight line, where ground crews were already clearing debris and preparing new hardstands. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German smirk vanished. Within 48 hours, brand new P-47 D-40 Thunderbolts filled the flight line, flown in directly from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in the attack, including many of their last instructors and squadron leaders, men they could never replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft across all targeted fields and replaced every one within a week. The numbers told the truth more clearly than any propaganda could. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts, more than any other American fighter of the war. At peak output, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every hour around the clock. The Evansville, Indiana plant, raised from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber.
The mighty Pratt & Whitney engine alone contained 2,400 precision-machined components, each fitted to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never even seen an airplane before the war, built these machines with astonishing skill and reliability. The scale of production didn't stop with aircraft. Ammunition output was equally staggering. Every P-47 sortie consumed roughly 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of P-47s flying daily, consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri alone produced 30 million rounds monthly, each cartridge manufactured with tolerances so fine they guaranteed flawless feeding in combat conditions. Fuel consumption, too, was immense. A single Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons of fuel per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection engaged. The 9th Air Force alone was consuming more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel each month by late 1944, all shipped across the Atlantic in tankers, themselves products of the same industrial miracle that kept the skies full of Thunderbolts. But perhaps even more impressive than the machines was the men who flew them. By 1944, the United States was training and graduating 30,000 pilots every year, more than Germany had produced during the entire war. Each P-47 pilot completed at least 400 hours of flight training before entering combat, including over 100 hours in advanced fighters. By the end of the war, German pilots were being rushed into battle with barely 100 hours total experience. The difference showed in combat. American pilots arrived in Europe thoroughly trained in formation flying, gunnery, navigation, and tactics. They had studied captured German aircraft, analyzed their strengths and weaknesses, and practiced against simulated opponents. They knew their machines inside and out, down to the last switch and system. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September 1944, later recalled, "I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 in the P-47. I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from real combat. On my first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight." In the end, the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just about speed or firepower. It was the story of an entire nation's capacity to build, to train, to fight, and to win. The Thunderbolt was not merely an aircraft. It was a symbol of industrial might, of technical mastery, and of a people determined to end tyranny by sheer force of will and production. In March of 1945, Oberstleutnant Joseph Priller, the same German ace who had once mocked the P-47 Thunderbolt as a pregnant cow 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials desperate to lift public morale. But his statement was never broadcast. It was deemed too demoralizing, too honest, a confession of the Luftwaffe's collapse and the transformation in German attitudes towards their former enemy. Priller said simply, "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter-bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat,
and never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10 and build 20. We lose 1 and it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage, and courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages had grounded most of its aircraft. Its veteran pilots were dead, captured, or too few to matter. Airfields lay in ruins, cratered and lifeless. Even if the Luftwaffe had planes and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. To take off was to die. Above every front, the P-47 Thunderbolt ruled the skies. From the mud at ground level to the thin blue air at 40,000 feet, its presence was constant, inescapable. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew only one combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with Thunderbolts over Leipzig lasted just 12 seconds. He said, "I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shuddered like it was struck by hammers. The engine exploded. The wing tore away. I barely escaped." Hanging in his parachute, he watched helplessly as his entire flight, 6 fighters, vanished in a storm of fire and wreckage. The sky, he said, rained burning aluminum and bodies. That was the psychological breaking point. German airmen began to suffer what medical officers called Yabo fever, fighter-bomber fever. Pilots developed physical symptoms of panic and nausea the moment Thunderbolts were reported nearby. Even veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against P-47s. On the ground, the reaction was just as immediate. The distinctive, thunderous growl of approaching Thunderbolts sent German soldiers diving for cover, a sound they had come to associate with death itself. The statistics of the P-47's destructive power defy comprehension. In the European theater alone, Thunderbolt pilots destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in aerial combat, and another 3,315 on the ground. They annihilated 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles.
December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance. Extreme structural strength. Firepower increasingly problematic. Pilots showing improved tactics. Assessment: significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter-bomber. Superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter-bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment: unsurvivable in direct engagement. 2 years earlier, the Thunderbolt had been a subject of ridicule, the fat American cow. By 1945, it had become the nightmare that haunted the last defenders of the Reich. 240 years later, in 1985, former enemies met again, this time in peace. At a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, they gathered to share memories and respect. Among them was Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, the former head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. When asked about the P-47, his answer was candid and unforgettable. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter." We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one. It was designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They knew that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and still deliver devastating firepower would win. And they were right. In the end, the P-47 Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a statement, a monument to industrial power, relentless innovation, and the determination of a nation that refused to lose. The Thunderbolt's roar was more than the sound of engines and guns. It was the sound of inevitability, of a world shifting, of tyranny crumbling under the weight of American steel and courage. The first time I flew a captured P-47 Thunderbolt after the war, I finally understood everything. The power was staggering, raw, unrestrained, and immediate. When you opened the throttle, it didn't so much climb as it leapt skyward, as if gravity itself had been overruled. The cockpit was wide and surprisingly comfortable. The visibility, exceptional. The controls, heavy, yes, but precise and honest. It was a pilot's airplane, wrapped in armor and built like a machine that intended to survive anything thrown at it. But what struck me most wasn't the way it flew, it was what it represented. America had built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more intricate than anything Germany had ever produced, and yet they built them faster than we could assemble our simplest fighters. That's when I knew, truly knew, we never had a chance. Those 8 high-caliber machine guns that lined its wings, we had a name for them, Roosevelt's piano. When they fired, they played a sound unlike anything else in the air, a deep mechanical rhythm that shook the air and stayed in your memory forever. Once you'd heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it obliterated it. Its design embodied the American industrial philosophy perfectly. Brute force engineering backed by limitless resources. Every part of the aircraft was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. The wing spars could support 40,000 pounds,
3 times the plane's loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces. The control cables were doubled throughout with automatic backup systems that engaged instantly if one line failed. Even the ammunition feed system was a masterpiece of practical design. 8 separate boxes, each holding 425 rounds, feeding their guns through electric boost motors that prevented jams during violent maneuvers. The guns themselves were electrically heated to prevent freezing at high altitude. Each could be charged independently, synchronized automatically, and adjusted for convergence between 150 and 400 yards, allowing pilots to fine-tune their fire for personal preference. It was not elegant engineering. It was American engineering. Simple, direct, and unstoppable. Some German veterans, even after the war, clung to the claim that the Thunderbolt had won through sheer quantity rather than quality, that German fighters were technically superior but were simply overwhelmed by numbers. The records tell a different story. In encounters where the numbers were equal, Thunderbolts still prevailed. The 8 heavy machine guns, long dismissed by German tacticians as inferior to 20mm cannon, proved more effective in real combat. Post-war analysis of gun camera footage explained why. Cannon shells were devastating, but only when they hit precisely, and ammunition was scarce. A typical German fighter carried between 120 and 200 rounds in total. In contrast, a Thunderbolt's guns created a storm of bullets, a probability cloud so dense that even imperfect aim produced lethal results. At common engagement ranges, a 2-second burst could put 20 or more rounds into a fighter-sized target, more than enough to tear it apart. Even the ammunition itself was superior. American 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed action fuse that penetrated before detonating. The incendiary core burned at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structures and fuel lines deep inside an aircraft. German 20mm shells, though larger, often exploded on contact, creating spectacular flashes, but sometimes only superficial damage. The Thunderbolt's weapons didn't just wound, they destroyed. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight, 10,000 pounds, was greater than the total loaded weight of some twin-engined aircraft. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced more power than entire bomber formations of the First World War. Its 8 Browning guns delivered more concentrated firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet, despite its complexity, it was built by the thousands. Assembled by workers, many barely out of school, maintained under mud-soaked, freezing combat conditions by mechanics who had learned their trade in mere weeks. In less than 2 years, German mockery turned to terror. The flying milk bottle that had once drawn laughter from Luftwaffe aces became the most feared aircraft they would ever face.
Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without hesitation spoke of the Thunderbolt in hushed tones decades later. Its very presence overhead was demoralizing, its silhouette a symbol of unstoppable American power. Today, At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47 Thunderbolt stands among the legends: the Mustang, the Lightning, the Corsair. Its placard lists specifications and combat statistics, the speed, the range, the tonnage of bombs dropped. But the real story is told in a small display case beside it. A strip of gun camera film and a few spent .50 caliber casings recovered from the wreckage of a Focke-Wulf 190. The footage shows the German fighter disintegrating under fire, fragments scattering in a blur of smoke and flame. Beneath it is a quote taken from a 1945 German interrogation report. It reads, "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. And that was the truth of it. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of ridicule, a lumbering brute that few believed could survive a fight with German fighters. But by the war's end, it had become an instrument of annihilation, a weapon so formidable it rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. 8 synchronized Browning machine guns carved their judgment across the skies of Europe, turning once arrogant laughter into silence. The Luftwaffe's greatest pilots had mocked the ungainly American fighter in the spring of 1943. By the spring of 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.